So there are three major modelings of the nature of religious belief that we'll go over in this class. Two of them stand as oppositions to each other. Literally, the latter of the first two that we discuss um, was written as a direct sort of reply to the first. And then the third is a standalone one, and we'll get to that when we get to it. So, of the first two, we have um, W.K. Clifford and his strong rationalism that he argues for in the Ethics of Belief. Right. So, this is a version of rationalism that is based in scientific evidence. Right. One of the things about rationalism is that by its nature, it makes appeals to reason, logic, and evidence. Right? And while faith and reason are not incompatible by any stretch of the imagination, uh, what is important for being able to reconcile the two or make them work together is a particular notion of what qualifies as evidence. Right? For W.K. Clifford, what qualified as evidence for his ethics of belief was going to be physical in nature, right? Or appeals to things that are quantifiable, right? A more scientific bent. Now, Clifford lived before and or during the time that science really started to solidify as its own separate set of disciplines. Um, Even during Newton's time and throughout the 1700s, 17 and early 1800s, sciences were not uh, they were not fully separated from philosophy still, right? Scientists were still very much natural philosophers. It was growing during Clifford's time that it was a growing change during Clifford's time that scientists were scientists, right? Studiers of nature, not philosophers of any sort. Even Newton was noted as a natural philosopher. He writes about natural philosophy in his papers. So, uh, the very basis of W.K. Clifford's The Ethics of Belief says that we have a responsibility to believe what reason gives us the most proof to believe. Now, proofs are going to be based on evidence, and evidence is therefore the most basic component of reasoning. It is, for Clifford, physical and accessible to the senses. This means it's not something that can just be felt or taken on faith alone. Right? Faith can't be a basis for reasoning for Clifford. Right? It has to be something that grows out of the evidence for a particular belief. Right? Um, his positions are really quite well summarized by his own statement within the paper, The Ethics of Belief, that it is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Right? Right? So there's not just this idea that we should believe, it's we have a moral obligation to believe what evidence tells us to, and to disregard anything else. So belief is a matter of ethics as much as anything else, and this extends to religious belief. Right? Our ethics should drive, or that ethical principle should drive the belief, not the other way around. The belief shouldn't drive our ethics. So the example he gives to illustrate this idea is the example of a shipwright. Um, it's an old profession. It's it's somewhat of a dying profession, just because modern ships have so many specialized parts that you need. Most modern ships are mechanical too, right? you need like engineers and specialists to take care of each part. But a shipwright was one whose job was to make sure a ship was in sailing order, right? And that a ship was seaworthy. This is the age of wooden vessels. Right? So the ship needed to be seaworthy before setting out to sea. When a ship came into harbor and docked after a particularly long voyage, the job was it always went to a shipping yard where a shipwright overlooked it and examined it. Right? So if the shipwright lets a ship out to sea that they believe isn't seaworthy, or that they have any reasonable doubts of being seaworthy, right? Any concerns about, then any deaths that result from this are the shipwright's fault. This is Clifford's argument. So similarly, our beliefs about the world are fundamentally a matter of ethics. We don't get a choice in believing whatever we want. We have a moral obligation to believe what our senses tell us, because our senses are our access to the world. And since our senses are our access to the world, we can't rely on faith regarding things that they do not provide that they do not provide access to. Right? And the evidence for God is something that's not sensory based. Right? So goes Clifford's argument, and thus we have an obligation to be atheistic, or at best agnostic. But even then, he says that agnosticism is really just theism or atheism in disguise, right? It's really theism in disguise, he argues, because you know, one who's truly agnostic, who if they relied or if one really relied on their senses, then they couldn't be truly agnostic. Right? So his is part of that tradition of thought I mentioned earlier that refers to and sees the idea that we cannot know as really a defense for uh, your own wavering beliefs and belief in the divine. All right. Now, Clifford's own stance is quite closed, which makes the juxtaposition and reply by William James uh, so appealing, I suppose, or so profoundly different.